5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Wonderful. We've taken our short break now, and we'd like to move forward on our agenda. We're very fortunate to have Rex Frazier with us today with the Personal Insurance Federation of California to help us better understand the insurance market in California. So welcome, Rex. We appreciate it. How are you?
Hi there. I'm well. Thank you for giving me a chance to share our views today. I appreciate it. Um, I do have a presentation. Is that okay? And it's all technically working and everything?
That's fine, and let us just open it up, make sure we're okay.
Perfect. If you could move to the next slide. As I understood from your staff, they suggested I should go about 15 minutes talking about what got us here, where we are, and maybe what's for the future, and then move to Q&A. Is that still okay?
Yes, that's wonderful. That's fine.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. My name is Rex Frazier. I'm president of the Personal Insurance Federation. And I'm in my, just about to finish my 19th year with this organization, represent large property casualty insurance companies. My hope today was to give you a little bit of background on who we represent, a couple key legal provisions that have really driven us to this point, some statistics on insurance experience. On my guess is you've already heard a little bit about those, particularly with the commissioner's framework. So maybe I could save you some time and not repeat things, and then really focus on where we're going to go, where we need to go on mitigation, if that would be okay. Would you please advance the slide? These are the logos of our members. So we represent names you would be familiar with, large property casualty companies, approaching now at this point about 3/4 of market share. If we could move to the next slide, and we represent those folks before the Department of Insurance and other executive branch venues, as well as in the legislature, and unfortunately sometimes we do have to go to court as well. Really the three key items that I would ask you to consider that are really part of the insurance issues we're trying to navigate. One is that we have a relatively rare set of rules in California compared to the rest of the country in terms of how an insurance rate is filed, ultimately reviewed, and hopefully approved. We have what's called a prior approval rate making system in California. So it's not like a gas station where you can just change the price that's on the sign whenever you need to. For an insurance company to change its rate either up or down, this includes rate decreases, they have to file really the most complicated set of filing requirements they have to meet in the country, justifying each element in a complicated rate formula, and then engage in a back and forth with the Department of Insurance that's quite robust. The second element is that members of the public, typically legal groups, they can join in, and they're treated as parties to the rate filings. So now, instead of the insurance company just negotiating with the state, they also have outside legal groups that can join in, and the insurance companies are required to pay them for their contributions to that as well. And of course, with 3 parties instead of 2, that means scheduling conflicts, and it's just more complicated. They're part of the law, so we're not generally grousing about it. But they are a material factor as to how long files take to get through the Department of Insurance. And I think is really the most urgent and pressing issue to consider. When I hear people talk about not being able to get insurance from an insurance company, I do cringe a little bit, because the California Fair Plan Association is the insurance industry. There's no tax dollars in the Fair Plan. There's no public governance of it. It is the insurance industry, and it's a fund set up by statute. If you look at the statute, it says it's a non-voluntary association of private insurance companies. So each insurance company that desires to do business in California and applies for a license to do so, they must join the FAIR Plan and voluntarily subject themselves to the rules of the FAIR Plan. And so the FAIR Plan does file its own rate filings. It's subject to prior approval, just like the normal. But the key difference is if the FAIR Plan runs out of money, it passes the hat among the insurance companies. There's no state bailout. It's a mandatory assessment on insurance companies to pay all the FAIR Plan. And that's typically would be after a big fire when companies are already paying their own claims. They would get a request, a demand that they have to satisfy to give the FAIR Plan money to top it up if it's deficient. And so to the extent that the FAIR Plan is growing and its funds are insufficient to be able to pay its own claims, it's going to turn around to the insurance industry and seek a guaranteed payment from them when those companies are already struggling to pay their claims. So this is an issue just that we can't forget. If you'd please move the slide forward. Very quickly, sort of how we got here, where we've been. This chart looks a little bit complicated. Hopefully I can make it not so complicated. This is a year-by-year, all industry-wide calculation of profitability dating back to 1991. If the bar is yellow, as a whole lost money that year. If the bar is green, that means that they made money that year. And the blue line tracks the cumulative impact. And so you can see throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s, homeowners insurance was a relative line of business. Companies would generally lose a little bit, but when you combine investment income, then they were able to achieve their targets, and the industry sort of ran that way. Then we had a sustained period of time with a lot of green bars. And so the industry, yearly was profitable on its insurance business. And so you see that blue line really going up. And it was during that time when insurance companies, even though they felt as if they faced increased risk, whether it was climate change or just their desire to move into higher risk areas, they largely were not able during that period of time to get any rate increases because the Department of Insurance was looking at these numbers. And they're saying, why would you guys need more money? You're making plenty. I see it in your statistics. And so for about a decade leading up to the big fires of 2017, the average premium in California, it didn't even keep up with inflation. And that's in the good old days when we had inflation, less than 2%, and it was a very low inflation environment. So virtually no movement during that period of those green bars. And then, of course, the unimaginable happens in Northern and Southern California in 2017. And you see the big yellow bar that in 1 year erases all the profitability dating back to 1991. And then, of course, we had a repeat in 2018 to minus 10 billion over that period of time. And now companies are trying to dig out. So 2017 was certainly a wake-up call. But it really was 2018 that was the bigger wake-up call. 2017, I think most companies felt like, wow, that was a bad year. They certainly knew they would get some money back because some of those fires were utility caused, and companies, insurance companies don't get all the money back they pay out in claims, but they do get a payment back from the utilities when they cause a fire, generally 50 or 60% of what they paid out. And in 2019, that green companies started getting paid, back. But in any event, it was really after the 2018 fire season where companies started to realize something's different. Do we really have a handle on this risk? If it's 1 year, that's okay. If it's 2 years like this, how many more years in a row are we going to have this happen? And what's going to be the long-term viability of the industry? And that's when you started seeing the market change, including, I think, was really the first month I remember seeing FAIR Plan policy count jump just 4% in a single month. And that's when you really started to see the market change. Would you please advance the next slide? When the representative representing the previous speaker representing a real estate perspective, when he was talking about the impact on rural area, I wanted to include this slide. This is from a study that was part of the state's climate change assessment, where they examined, during this time period, this was of this study was 2007 through 2014. What was the change in distribution of premium? And there's definitely been a change in the distribution of premium from lower risk to higher risk areas. The important thing to note is when an insurance company gets a rate approval, they get what is called permission to charge a maximum permitted earned premium on a statewide basis. So they are permitted to charge X amount of dollars on a statewide basis. That premium, if they decide they're going to charge more in high risk areas, they have to offset that because they can't charge more than their statewide permitted earned premium. And so you can see, I really think as companies started to adopt more technology that allowed a finer risk assessment, you see what has happened. In low risk areas, the average premium's gone down during that study period, and it was offset by high risk areas. So there's no doubt that carriers have been getting more serious about trying to identify high risk and rate it accordingly, because the way the law works in California, there's a specific section that says no rate shall be inadequate, excessive, or unfairly discriminatory. So insurers are not permitted to arbitrarily hold down risk associated with high risk properties and make low risk properties subsidize that. If the state wants to, in other ways, help people who are struggling with high payments, that's of course a normal discussion for government to consider. But the way the law works under a ballot measure from 1988 called Proposition 103, carriers, they're not supposed to be in the business of saying, well, this doesn't seem right, let's go ahead and artificially hold down premiums here and have other people subsidize that. Would you advance the slide, please? California, because of that time period where, in the lead up to 2017, for about 10 years, there weren't really many premium increases. Compare it to the rest of the country, on average, now I know earlier in the testimony you've heard, there are certainly case studies that are well above average, and that means there's lots of case studies that are well below average. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm numb to those incredibly high quotes that people are getting. But when you take all insured properties and produce an average, and you do that in every state, California continues to be at or below the national average of the average premium paid. And that's without regard to the higher average personal income in California and the average higher costs to rebuild in California. So if you look at the top states, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas, what do they have in common? They're Gulf states, they're hurricane states, and they've been dealing with the ravages of hurricane liability now for 20 years. And you can see what that's, their costs have gone up, premiums have gone up. And imagine, if in California, the average is $1,200 or $1,300, and in Louisiana, it's $2,000. But it's a whole lot more expensive to rebuild a home in California than it is in Louisiana. And so all I'm suggesting by pointing this out is California, prior to the 2017 fires, insurers were a little bit in a hole. And then all of a sudden, I think the changing conception of the risks they face completely exploded, and they found themselves pretty desperate to try to figure out how to get out of the hole. And so, does someone have a question? And so there's no doubt in the short term that insurers are pursuing higher permitted rate levels. We can get into a discussion about how that experience is with the department, the time frame, and all of that. But obviously, as as we get to the end of my presentation, rate increases alone just simply are not the solution. There are capital issues that companies are trying to deal with now to get out of a hole and make sure that they're sufficiently capitalized to do business and hopefully grow in California. But ultimately, we have to get a better handle on hazard reduction, standards for mitigation, and ultimately community-wide agreement on what it's going to take to make communities more insurable. Because in the long term, that's what we have to do, and that's going to be hard. It's difficult to execute mitigation programs. There's a lot of community discord when it comes to vegetation removal. So it's a weighty subject. Would you please advance the slide? Our key issues, which I suppose I can breeze through unless you have more questions. One, in California, it's a relatively onerous rate review process, takes a long period of time. There's a lot of reasons for that. I certainly don't want to be in the position of criticizing the state. I understand they have their culture and their processes, and we look forward to working through those with them. The second point I normally would delve into more is, California is fairly unique in two key provisions of how you calculate an insurance rate, and that's hurting insurance companies' ability to remain in high-risk areas. As part of the commissioner's framework, he announced he is willing to take a look at these two issues, as long as allowing insurers to use more modern rating methods in California will ensure more availability in high-risk areas. And I think our membership is generally looking forward to when the commissioner promulgates those regs and insurers are permitted to make these new filings. And then lastly, fair plan growth. At this point, we're in a race between, are we going to get the regular market back operating and depopulate the fair plan, or are we going to have an event where the fair plan puts incredible financial stress on, run out of money and seek to be topped up by the insurance companies? And for small companies, what that could do to them could be catastrophic, and for larger ones, it could result in a capital hit that would change their ability to serve as many customers. If we can move quickly to the next slide. Just to show you, in California, for homeowners insurance, it takes a pretty long time to get a homeowners insurance filing through. This has been particularly difficult following, out of the pandemic, where we had huge increases in the cost of labor and the cost of building materials, and ultimately in home reconstruction costs. So when companies are facing, when it comes to home repair, 15, 20, 25% inflation in some sectors of the home reconstruction or home building market, when you're asking for a rate increase and it could take, 275 or more days to get an increase, by the time you get the increase, obviously it's less effective because inflation has eaten into that, and then you have to come back to the department and ask for more. So it's there is a consequence to the price control structure that we have and how long it takes to get through. We're not suggesting deregulation or suggesting that the state shouldn't look at insurance company rate levels. That's the law, and that's not going to change. But when we take as long as we do, there's a cost to that. If we can go to the next slide, unless you're interested in learning more about the details of our rate structure, I'm happy to move beyond it. But we do require insurance companies to project wildfire losses using a long-term backward-looking average that doesn't really look at today's circumstances. It makes it difficult for companies to go into high-risk areas, so we're hoping to get that changed. And then the next slide is another issue that, dealing with reinsurance. If you could move that slide. And reinsurance is a necessary part of an insurance company's business strategy. Typically, there's not enough money held by insurance companies on their own books to write every policy for every applicant in California. So what they do is they'll sell insurance, and then when they hit certain points, they will start to sell the business they have in force around the globe to other insurance companies. And then that frees up capital for the companies here to continue writing more and multiply the number of policies that they can sell. absent the reinsurance market, we just simply wouldn't be serving all the policies we are in California. And so California treats those reinsurance costs differently than most other states, and we're hoping that that can be updated as well. The next slide, please. The FAIR Plan, though, is what I would ask you to take extremely seriously. You know, the FAIR Plan has grown precipitously since really 2019 is you know, when you could see the boom. You know, there's three channels to get insurance. There's what are called the admitted market companies. That's who we represent. They're people who go to the Department of Insurance and they get a license. They're fully subject to the Department of Insurance jurisdiction. They're subject to courts and can be sued in California. You have the non-admitted market, and those are companies that are not subject to California's jurisdiction, can't be sued here. You might
Rex,
recognize a name.
That's surplus lines, right, Rex?
Exactly, surplus line.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so the reason they're called surplus lines is there are restrictions typically on when someone can be what's called exported to the surplus line market or the non-admitted market. You have to show that you're unable to get insurance through the admitted market. In the past, that used to be very difficult. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier. But the reason why the state allows residents to do business with companies where, in essence, you're doing a transaction with a company in another state or even another country, is it's sort of a pressure valve. If you can't get help with the California companies, you're allowed to then go to the non-admitted market. There's lots of security for those transactions. I don't want to portray them the wrong way. They're a necessary part of the market. And you can certainly see in 18 how there was a bump where they came in, and then that sort of tailed off. And then the third way to get insurance is through the FAIR Plan. You know, so there's really three channels. And the FAIR Plan, the growth we're seeing, you know, just through 2022, upwards of 300,000 policies. At the end of 2024, it would not surprise me if that's 375 or 400,000 policies. And there's a huge consequence that comes with that, because the FAIR Plan, you know, you can see many scenarios where there's going to be an event where they're unable to pay all the claims, and then they make a capital call on the insurance companies. If you could advance the slide. The FAIR Plan gave some testimony last year to the Assembly Insurance Committee, and this was one of the slides that they had in their presentation. And they were just showing various scenarios. This was, you know, as of August of last year. You can see various scenarios of the types of fire events that they could have in various communities around California. And, you know, obviously the one in orange, Lake Arrowhead, if they have a $7.5 billion event, you know, they don't have nearly that claims paying capacity. And so that's going to fall on the insurance companies to go ahead and top them up. And that's going to be debilitating. So, you know, trying to figure out what to do with this increasing FAIR Plan exposure, that's certainly top of mind for us, because there's just, it would be unreasonable if all of a sudden the FAIR Plan needs $4 or $5 billion from the insurance industry when those companies are already paying their own claims from that very same event. This worries us greatly. And then if you could go 2 slides in advance, I'll just close. I know I'm going a little long. I'm sorry. Just one more, please. One more slide. Mitigation is obviously our long-term focus that I think we share with so many others. In the short term, the insurance industry has worked very diligently to come up with parcel level mitigation recommendations through the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. And they put out the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard for parcel level guidance last year. The town of Paradise was the first town to require new construction to be wildfire prepared home compliant. The Department of Insurance has promulgated new regulations requiring insurers to provide more granularity into the types of mitigation discounts that they recognize, and to have a capability so that policyholders who have questions are able to ask those questions and get them answered. Insurers made those, each insurer was required to make their mitigation filings in mid-April of 2023. And so we look forward to those mitigation filings getting through the process. I know the Department of Insurance has a heavy workload, and so they're still chewing on those filings. And so to the extent those filings start emerging from the department, I think you'll see a different type of discussion about mitigation discounts because they'll be fully incorporated into companies' filings. While parcel level mitigation is important, I think really the bigger problem is we need to come up with standards for community level mitigation that insurers can explain to homeowners associations and city elders, city council members and boards of supervisors, and help them understand the choices that are before them, that if they want to demonstrably reduce hazard that insurance companies would be concerned about, to help them understand where that hazard is, how much of the hazard needs to be reduced in order to make a community more insurable. And I think that's going to be a terribly difficult process where there are going to be communities that move to beautiful areas because people like those circumstances. And for insurers to come along and say, well, we have some risk concerns about the vegetation around this community, insurers would never force communities to make decisions. It's their job to signal these risks and hazards. But there's a lot of difficult discussions ahead when it comes to community level mitigation. Maybe I'll stop there. Obviously, I could yammer for a long time, but hopefully I didn't go too long, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Rex. Questions from the dais? Great. Deputy Controller Emran.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Mr. Frazier, I want to also thank you for your presentation today. I thought it was very important that you're here and you're discussing your perspective in a very ongoing conversation, what many of us are calling a crisis here. I wanted to talk a little bit about homes that are in the wildland urban interface, the WUI. So according to the Insurance Information Institute, moving into risk-prone areas referred to as the WUI are one of the key factors driving the state's insurance market challenges. More people, homes, businesses, and infrastructure are locating in these zones. It means more costly damage when extreme events occur. Californians, roughly 5.1 million homes are in these WUI areas. And can you kind of speak to, I think it's a little bit of a middle ground, because it's the idea of building smart, not necessarily building in the WUI areas, but same time people are being pushed out of city centers, they cannot afford it. There's residents that have been living there for generations that don't want to leave. And can you just kind of explain a little bit how we as a state can kind of find a middle ground in this WUI effort? And how,
yes,
how the insurance industry kind of models around that too, please? Thank you.
You bet. You bet. I think the difficulty for insurers has been that, I think it's well recognized that it's difficult to execute urban infill housing developments at scale, just because of whether it's community opposition or just difficulties, whether it's through permitting and environmental review or whatever may be the reason. It does seem as if and I'm not a housing developer or wouldn't pretend to be one, but it does seem as if it's easier to execute a development the further out the company would go, maybe when they're dealing in more rural areas and they're dealing with county boards of supervisors that might welcome that development versus doing something in a big city. And that's understandable because it's going to be cheaper to build homes out there, people can afford it more, and a developer can probably get through that process easier. Well, that means putting more valuable property nearer to things that burn. And it's not just forested areas. You look at Southern California, Orange County beach communities. Some of those communities are as fire exposed as you could imagine, with bushes that go up and burn like wicks and ultimately can create huge fire hazards. So it's not just in tree areas, it's in chaparral areas, it can be in grassy areas. And we just have more housing stock being built in closer proximity to fuel. And oftentimes, we have home developments that are built in areas where there's even been a fire before. Remember in Coffee Park in Santa Rosa when that community was devastated by fires. There was an identical fire to that in 1964 that hit that area. It was called the Hanley Fire. And if you look at the footprint of that fire versus the Hanley Fire, it's the same because the topography hasn't changed. There's a major wind corridor that pushes wind through there and creates a distinct flame pattern. And so, it was devastating in 1964, but then, 50 years later or more, you see houses built there in a higher density. So, the role of insurers to figure out how do we construct a payment system where there's enough money coming in so that they can maintain their promises, because that's what an insurance contract is. It's a promise to pay under specified circumstances. And so the more we allow building in WUI areas, the more we've got to think through the consequences of those development patterns. And that's, insurers have not viewed that as anything other than that's a local decision. It's not the insurance company's business to tell communities how to live. It's the insurance company's role to signal the risk associated with those decisions that a community would make. And so the difficulty is we certainly, through our IBHS research and other advocacy, certainly supportive of fire-wise communities and fire-safe councils and have been long involved there. I serve on the board of the Fire Safe Council. It's important to us. The level mitigation, and in edge cases, that can be the difference in a small fire. I think what we certainly have come to believe is that in giant fires, whether it's Paradise or another high profile fire where you've got flames that are 75 or 100 feet high, a homeowner can do everything right. They can do home hardening, they can engage in defensible space activities, and the home still has a high probability of going up and being lost. And that's where insurers, what should they do? They want to, of course, recognize hard work of policyholders who have put money out of their pocket and made their homes harder and their defensible space better. But there are community level mitigation concerns that we have to get our arms around, and those are not going away anytime soon. And so to me, that's where I think we know it's our responsibility to try to advance the state of science when it comes to community mitigation and develop standards and a vocabulary that communities can understand. This is the situation we're in. Look at the parts of your community that are really driving insurability concerns. While we know we need to do that, we're knee deep in that research now, and it's not done. I wish it was, and we know we have a responsibility to do that, but it's not done now. The insurance industry, really starting in the early 1990s, had to deal with this in the Southeast on hurricane, and spent a good 10 years advancing the state of hurricane, understanding how to make a home resilient to wind, which ultimately has had a dramatic impact in southeastern states. We know we need to do the same thing here, but fire is more complicated than wind. With hurricane, you can do everything you need to your house, and your house is good, and you're not worried about your neighbors, you're not worried about your community. With fire, it's different. You can do everything right, and your neighbor can do something wrong, and your house catches on fire. So it's just a lot more complicated dynamics. So I'll stop there. Did I reasonably answer your question, or what?
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Yes, sir, you did, and I appreciate the great points that you made. Here at the Board of Equalization, we're on the front lines. The state has a goal of 3 million homes by 2030, but also the idea of building smart and proactive land use planning so we can when we do build these homes, it's in a community that's going to be safe for the long term. So my next and last question, you mentioned a little bit in your presentation about risk management tools, such as catastrophic modeling. And my question is about is it a new model that you're building, or is it a model that's already existing and you're inputting data into it? And that leads to the question of, are zip codes the highest determiner of high risk in this data modeling that you are producing or may be creating now? And are there certain
Well,
areas with the zip code which are lower risk than other areas in the same zip code?
Yeah, no, those are the right questions to ask. So there's two types of models. When people talk about models, there's really two types. One, insurers have been using for a very long time, are fully permitted to use. Another, they use in every other state except California, and are hopeful that they can use those in California. So, excuse me, there's a lot of attention paid to the so-called risk segmentation models where you get a score for your home. Okay, those are allowed. The leading vendor over time has been Fireline. There's other companies that want to challenge the incumbent. Zesty AI is a new more tech-oriented company. So you've got competition in that space. Those models, they're not really what's at issue for the insurers. What's at issue for the insurers is how you calculate the statewide maximum premium they're permitted to charge. So under the California's rate regulation rules, the way that you make a rate filing, the output of the Department of Insurance's formula is what's called a minimum permitted premium and a maximum permitted earned premium. And so the state will tell you, well, in order for your rate to not be inadequate, you have to charge at least X on a statewide basis. Let's say it's $100. And then in order to prevent it from being excessive, you can charge no more than $150. And so you go through the Department of Insurance and they say, here's the range of what the rate formula would tolerate so that you're not charging rates that are inadequate or excessive. So when you get permission from the state, let's say to charge $150 on a statewide basis, that has nothing to do with the zip code of any property. So when we're talking about these risk segmentation models where you look at zip code, you don't look at zip code when you go to the Department of Insurance to get your permitted premium. Okay, so to do that, the question is, how do you project your future losses? Because that's a big part of calculating what your rate should be. So in California, we are the only state that says you project your future wildfire costs by looking backward at how many wildfire claims you've paid over the last 20 years. Okay, so for ease of calculation, because a claim could be like a one-off house fire, that's not a wildfire claim, or it could be part of a bunch of different homes catching on fire at once, and that's coded in your data as a wildfire claim. And so the state says, well, okay, over the last 20 years, let's say a company's paid $20 million out in claims for wildfire-related claims. They average $1 million a year. Under the state's rules, then looking forward, a company would be able to project, we're allowed to include in our premiums $1 million a year to pay wildfire. Okay. Well, we don't understand why that's a wise approach, because what happened 20 years ago, what does that have to do now? More importantly, if a company says, well, I'm willing to go and write in higher risk areas, I'm willing to go into Tuolumne County or Mono or really high risk communities up in the Sierras, the way the department's rules work, you get no credit for that. You can't charge a higher premium level because all you get to do is look backward what you've paid for the last 20 years. And we say we should be incentivizing insurance companies to write in high risk areas. And if they say they're going to open up in areas that are higher risk, they can demonstrate through models that are widely accepted across the country what they anticipate will be the increased claims payment that they're going to be responsible for when they go into these higher risk areas. It makes sense that if you're going to go to the state and say, hey, what should we be able to charge? You ought to be able to have a discussion with the state about how close are you to things that would burn. But that's not the way we do it here. We say it's irrelevant how close you're going to be to high risk areas, because we're just going to look at this simple backward looking 20-year average and use that to determine your projected losses. And so we think this is a self-inflicted wound. The only way companies under that system can charge more is they have to go into areas, sustain a bunch of losses, then go back to the Department of Insurance and say, wow, we had really high losses. Will you let us charge more now? And companies aren't going to do that, right? So until we have a system that recognizes when you're going to go towards the risk, you should be empowered to charge more, we're going to have these problems. The frustrating thing for us is for earthquake insurance, what I'm advocating, that's the system we already have in California for earthquake insurance. If a company wants to sell earthquake insurance closer to faults, the department says, oh, it seems like you're going to have higher losses. We ought to let you charge more. And that's the way the regulations work now. We think it should be the same for wildfire. If a company is going to do more business in high wildfire areas, that should be picked up in their rate calculation. So I went through that technical and boring thing, but hopefully with the result of helping you see, when we talk about zip codes, that's not the fight we're having. We're talking about what are the rules for being able to charge a statewide premium. And then from there, once the state says, okay, well, now you're allowed to charge $100 a year. The next step is companies use those risk assessment tools to figure out who's going to pay what. So if the state says, okay, you're going to have 10 customers and you're allowed to charge $100 a year, so the average would be $10 a year for a customer. The second step is to use these other risk models where parcels are assigned a score, and based on that, someone might pay 11 and someone might pay 9, right? But that's a second stage after what we're more focused on, which is how are companies allowed to make enough money on a statewide basis so they can serve everybody. That's what's driving availability issues. It's not related to sort of this step 2 when it comes to how do they allocate the permitted premium versus this homeowner or that homeowner. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. I would really want to thank you again. And it's interesting how artificial intelligence is coming into the picture when you're talking about risk management tools as well. So thank you again, Mr. Vice Chair, and I'll yield back to you. Thank you again, Mr. Frazier, too. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's see, Member Schaefer, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Member Gaines. Mr. Frazier, calling your attention to the California Department of Insurance slow to approve rate filings in your PowerPoint presentation. I'm appalled that it's taken 349 days. How does that compare with other jurisdictions? Do they have a year or so to say yes or no to people, or are we unique?
Well, I certainly don't want to get my membership in trouble by being critical of the state. They're very powerful, sir. But we are relatively uncommon, I would say. We've got a fairly rigorous process. And even in other big states, New York or other big complicated jurisdictions that have a consumer protection attitude like California does, it would be very uncommon in those other states to have numbers like that.
You have 41 applications or filings approved. Do we know how many would be disapproved or not approved, or is that very few?
Typically, in this circumstance, I mean, there are many occasions over time where a company would ask for an increase, and the state would not only reject the increase but order a decrease. So but under these circumstances, over the last few years, with the fire losses having been so profound in 2017 and 2018, the way the Department of Insurance's formula works, you have a really high average annual wildfire loss. That 20-year average that I was talking about, right now it's producing rate indications for companies that are very significantly higher, 20, 30, 40%. We've seen indications in filings where a company, they would never ask for this, but under the department's rules, they could charge, get approval for 60 or 70% increases. They don't do it because they're not ready to do that to their customers. But generally, over the last 3 or 4 years, companies are able to achieve under the department's rules increases. It's difficult, even though the department has a formula that puts out a number. There's lots of actuaries that argue about the numbers back and forth. And so when a company thinks under the department's rules, let's say it could get approval for a 20% increase, oftentimes the state's rate analysts and actuaries, they'll disagree about an assumption that a company actuary might make, and they'll be haggling back and forth. And that's where this time goes, is generally arguing about actuarial assumptions. And that could go on for 10, 20, 50, 75 questions from the Department of Insurance that just take a long time. And so companies are generally able to achieve rate increases over the last few years, not always exactly what they request, but it might get chipped away, whether it's from the department staff aren't convinced or whether it's from these external law firms that file to participate as well. They generally want to push the number down because that's how they justified getting paid legal fees. They wouldn't necessarily have as strong a case to get legal fees unless they get some accommodation in the filing. And so all this stuff takes time, and to the extent a company, it takes a long time for them to get an approval and it's less than they're seeking, it just means they have to turn around and make another filing. And in the meantime, they're not able to take on as much risk because they weren't able to get that result out of the process.
Well, it's refreshing to hear that sometimes they've asked for a request for an increase and ended up with a decrease. I can just see them saying, sorry, I asked. And this might have a sort of a chilling effect on asking for increases, which is good. I am a customer of State Farm, who've always been very good to me. The only criticism I have is there'll be a small adjustment in rate approvals, and they'll send me a check of a refund of something like 35 cents or something. It's a trifle amount. It costs much more to write the check and much more to mail it. I've been told that the insurance laws require that every refund be done. I would like to figure out some way that we could decree that there shall be no checks written for less than $1 and no bills made for less than $1, because I think it's inefficient and just something, that's not good public policy to be sending checks or asking for payments of any amount less than $1. I know that's not your division, but I just want you to know it's insurance related. And I'm also very astounded that it takes such a long time to approve anything. I would like to see maybe a 100-day rule or so for approval, because justice delayed is justice denied. I want to thank you for your time here today, too. I appreciate everything you had to say. You
bet, sir. On the timing, the ballot measure that instituted the elected insurance commissioner and the price control rules, Proposition 103, was a ballot measure in 1988. It includes with it a promise of 60-day approval. So it says any rate application that's not approved within 60 days shall be deemed approved. And so the deal back in 1988 was we're going to have price controls, but it's not going to mess up the market because at least we're going to have quick consideration of matters. Obviously, things have gotten away from us, and typically on day 59, insurance companies, if they're not going to get an approval in 60 days, will receive a request from the state to waive their rights to the 60-day approval. And companies are told if they don't waive their rights to an approval in 60 days, then the Department of Insurance will have no choice but to refer the matter to administrative litigation for the appointment of an administrative law judge. And of course, that's not a short process. So it's really two bad options: waive your rights to review within 60 days or go to trial. We're hoping for a door number 3 because both of those choices are bad.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Chair Lieber.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Mr. Frazier. And
been a long
I
time.
really appreciate you bringing your many long years of experience here. I know you've been involved in all these items for decades. And I wanted to ask you for some clarifications about the FAIR plan. Um, the FAIR plan told us earlier today that they obviously have reinsurance. Are they paying the rack rate for that reinsurance, or is that deeply discounted in some way?
Well, it used to be that the FAIR plan was allowed to include their actual reinsurance costs in their rate filing. You know, the FAIR plan preceded Prop 103, so they're not technically required, to comply with the same rules as admitted companies are. But the Department of Insurance still expects the FAIR plan to be subject to prior approval rules. But it's only been probably the last 6 or 7 years that the state prohibited the FAIR plan from including their reinsurance costs in their rate filings. That makes it difficult because, as the reinsurance market has changed and it's become a lot more expensive, it's a lot more expensive than for whether it's the FAIR plan or the admitted companies to afford enough reinsurance coverage to keep doing what they want to do. And so I believe last year was the first year where in the FAIR plan's reinsurance tower, there was more insurance company co-participation for assessments. So when people think about reinsurance, you would think, oh, it's like a tower where the company has a certain amount of capital, then they have a layer for reinsurers to pay, and then when you run out the top of your reinsurance receivables, then you go assess the insurance companies. That's the way it's typically been in the past, but because the reinsurance market's been so difficult, last year was the first year where as soon as reinsurance recoverables start coming in, insurance companies have to also start making assessment payments. And that's new. But it was a way to stretch the dollar more so that the FAIR plan could get more reinsurance. So even though, they have a normal professional reinsurance program, it's a lot different for carriers now because it takes a lot smaller event that could trigger a FAIR plan assessment because of the way there's this co-participation up the reinsurance tower. That's totally new. So it's not going to take a huge event for the FAIR plan to start issuing assessments to the insurance companies.
Okay, thank you. That's very informative. And in terms of the counties that are really on the front line of the wildfire, not urban interface, but suburban interface, who are the players that are best situated to talk to those boards of soups that are approving planning? And I've seen constituents of mine who are older and are living with disabilities who, for example, moved to Paradise because the costs were so much less, and they could both then afford their housing and the care that they needed. So which players in the ecosystem are best situated to talk with those boards of soups about the impact of their decisions?
Well, that's a tough one. There are some critics of developments that call us and try to get us involved at the planning level, and we typically that's not the role we see ourselves. There was one development in San Diego County where we looked at it and said, come on, there's mountains on three sides and one way out. Are you sure you really want to do this? But we only were willing to say that because we knew that community is going to face insurance struggles and they're going to be mad at us. And so we at least wanted to let them know in advance, hey, you're making a decision here that's going to have a consequence. But generally, I think when you talk with builders, they're trying their best to come up with whether it's better configurations of their community, whether it's putting more green belts, things that may seem simple, but like, how about you don't put the golf course in the middle of the community, put it on the outskirts of the community so it provides a green belt. They're trying their best to figure out how, in the limited number of places where they can build, how they can do their best in a difficult situation and make these communities as safe as possible. We're just very unlikely to go in there and try to convince a board of supervisors that we know what's in their interest. That's going to be a choice for them.
I think that's very intelligent of you to deflect from adopting that role. Thank you.
Okay, great. Member Vasquez, questions?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Just a quick question. First of all, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Frazier. I just had a question on the issue of solvency for both private insurers and the California Fair Plan. Solvency is critical in all of this. What do you recommend as 3 key steps moving forward to achieve that while at the same time serving the best interests of the homeowners?
Yeah. I mean, what we have now is the worst of all world because we're driving a bunch of people into the FAIR plan, which is always going to be more expensive than going to an admitted company. It's a high risk pool. It's going to be higher. It's like in the health insurance world when we tried to have catastrophic health insurance risk pools. You know, we used to have something called Mr. Mid, where an individual that with a catastrophic health condition, they would go there and the state would help them get individual coverage, and that folded because there wasn't enough money when you have that much adverse selection, that much high risk all put in one pool. And so that's what the FAIR plan is. Only people who have to go there, and necessarily they're going to be on average a higher risk, right? So until we can get our rating system under control so that companies are able to accumulate enough capital to be solvent and then resume growing in high risk areas, we're driving a bunch of people to the FAIR plan, which is something we should not want to do. They're paying more than they would if they would be with an admitted company. And the FAIR plan growth at this point, it's simply not sustainable. So in terms of a priority, starting to think about now and trying to achieve consensus among policymakers about how do we prevent a catastrophic loss that the FAIR plan can't pay from debilitating the admitted market. That's what we have to focus on. You know, when a normal insurance company would go bankrupt. So let's take the example. There was a company where the Paradise Fire was finally the last straw for them, and they were unable to keep going. Merced Property and Casualty. And this was a really good, respectable company. I think they had been around 75 years. They were a good company, and they just were concentrated in a way where they got hit particularly hard by that fire, and they weren't able to pay all their liabilities. Well, under California law, there's something called the California Insurance Guarantee Association, CIGA, which is just the insurance industry. And CIGA steps in and starts paying the claims of those, in that case, Merced policyholders. Because, of course, we don't want people not to be able to rebuild their house just because their insurance company went bankrupt. And so under California law, we have a system where all policyholders in the state pass the hat, give that money through their insurance companies to CIGA so that CIGA has enough money to make sure people get their claims paid. So that's the way the system works now. So if CIGA, they have a cash balance, but if it's not a big enough cash balance in order to pay all those claims, they turn around, just like the FAIR plan, and they go to the insurance companies and say, hey, we need X amount of money, give it to us. And the insurance companies are compelled. They have to give CIGA that money so that CIGA can turn around and pay, in this case, Merced's policyholders. But California law also requires, this is not discretionary, they require the insurance companies, whatever they paid, the insurance companies have to turn around and apply a surcharge on all their policyholders and collect that money back so that it doesn't jeopardize the solvency of those insurance companies. And I'm guessing the state does it that way because they know there's going to be a lot of pressure on insurance companies not to try to recoup that money back from their customers. So the state makes them do it, and the Department of Insurance cannot prevent it. So if CIGA's, let's say they're $100 million short, and let's say the market leader, State Farm, they write 20% of the business, so they'd have to pay $20 million. State law would require State Farm then to turn around and apply a total of $20 million of surcharge to their customers. And that's how the guarantee system works now. Well, that doesn't apply to the FAIR plan because the FAIR plan is not a normal insurance company. The FAIR plan, under current law, it's unclear what happens in that circumstance. So what happens if there's a huge event, the FAIR plan doesn't have enough money to pay, they turn around and assess the insurance companies. Well, what do we do? If the insurance companies just have this indefinite liability where they have to give the fair plan unlimited sums of money. And remember, that's, for policyholders that the insurance companies already declined, and that's why these people are in the fair plan. So now if insurance companies have this unlimited liability to the fair plan, if they're not able to recoup that in some way, similar to what we do with SIGA, well, we're going to drive companies out of the market. So I'm not saying I know the answer right now, but certainly we have to figure out a way so that a fair plan assessment does not drive companies into a ditch.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Rex. I just had a question, if I could, in terms of wrapping up, because you've covered a lot of ground here, and it's been really helpful. But maybe you could just conclude with what steps need to take place to attract insurers back into the California market. And I know that you've talked a lot about that in different elements, but can you condense that into a couple of points?
Yeah, I would say we certainly accept the commissioner's leadership in pushing for this framework. What he's trying to do, I think we understand the trade-offs that he's urging us all to consider. And the important thing is to get the regulations out of the Department of Insurance so we can start having a public debate about the best way forward to allow the use of modern rating tools. And, the commissioner has made it clear that he's not okay with using those modern rating tools unless he knows that it's going to increase the amount of business written in high-risk areas. While our members don't love that, that's the nature of a trade-off or a compromise. And if that's the direction the commissioner says he wants to go, I think we're ready to accept that and try to figure out terms to make that workable. So that's the key for us, is to get those regulations under public debate, start getting to the point where they finalize some rules, because right now it's illegal for insurance companies to make filings using these modern rating tools. And until we can do that, we're not going to see a huge change in the market. So we're certainly eager to work with the commissioner and all those who have opinions on this matter, and we got to get going on that.
Okay, so you're waiting for the regulations to come from the Department of Insurance on these reforms that have been proposed by the insurance commissioner.
Yes, sir.
Is that the next step?
Yes, the framework that the commissioner outlined and that the governor had mentioned in an executive proclamation had talked about the use of modeling and reinsurance in exchange for a definition of sort of distressed areas where companies, when they would make filings using modeling and reinsurance, they would have to also show how they're going to have adequate writings in these distressed areas. So there's going to have to be a regulation that defines what's a distressed area, and that's necessarily a difficult and political decision, because every assembly member and senator is going to want their communities in the definition of distressed area. So I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy for the Department of Insurance to thread the needle there, but that's a challenge they have in front of them. And then what are going to be the standards that they would impose for companies to be able to project their losses using forward-looking models and to reflect reinsurance costs? These are going to be tough matters. So we understand it's hard for career staff at the Department of Insurance to come up with these rules. And when they're ready to talk, whether it's through workshop or otherwise, we're ready to go.
Wonderful. And then if you could just touch again on this assessment for the FAIR Plan. You mentioned that was the first time that had occurred, I don't know in how many years, but you tied that to the challenge of finding reinsurance in the market. And so are you saying that we need regulation more similar to SIGA and provide that clarity for the FAIR Plan?
Sorry to interrupt you. Well, that's certainly one avenue I would urge us to explore. If our system is going to be that there's unlimited liability for the insurance companies for FAIR Plan deficiencies, that's not sustainable. So if there's no mechanism for FAIR Plan assessments to ultimately be recouped by insurers, how much longer can we go if the FAIR Plan's growing and growing their liabilities are getting to the point where they're going to be issuing potentially massive assessments to the insurance companies, and how are insurance companies going to pay those, right? So we're just deferring these difficult decisions while we allow the FAIR Plan to grow. And, to some extent, have the official public policy of California to be crossing our fingers and hoping that there's not a huge fire while we allow folks to use the FAIR Plan to satisfy their mortgage lender requirements. But it's certainly not a sustainable long-term strategy.
Well, there is an option potentially through working with the California Department of Insurance on latitude for insurance companies to provide higher rates in some of these wildfire areas that in fact would be lower than the FAIR Plan. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
That's certainly correct. And we do look forward to the further refinement and development of the FAIR Plans of their clearinghouse. There was a bill a few years ago that required the FAIR Plan to establish a clearinghouse where admitted insurance companies can go to the FAIR Plan and say, hey, as part of getting a rate increase, we've committed to take, I'm just making 10,000 policyholders out of the FAIR Plan with this risk profile. Can you give us that information, FAIR Plan, so that we can solicit those customers? And there's a bunch of difficulties with that that we're going to have to work through. My guess is it's going to take legislation. But, Mr. Gaines, you're an insurance producer. How would you feel if, you had a customer that you didn't have a market for and you sent that customer to the FAIR Plan, and now a company you don't have an appointment with all of a sudden says, hey, I want to solicit that customer. And you'd be like, well, wait a second, that's my customer. I don't want you taking my customer away, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we handle those circumstances? We're going to have to deal with that. We're also going to have to deal with, would the state think there's any privacy issues with the FAIR Plan sharing that information with insurance companies that want to depopulate the FAIR Plan? So I do think there's some issues to work through to make the clearinghouse a viable source or a viable tool for insurance companies when they're going to be making these new filings under the commissioner's framework. And as part of that, there's going to be an expectation to depopulate the FAIR Plan. What are the mechanics of making that work and making it smooth? I think we've got some work ahead of us.
Yeah, there aren't any easy answers. I mean,
no.
I've talked to a lot of insurance agents that have lost companies. They've just pulled out of the market here in California, so they're losing business anyway. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges in front of us, and hopefully we can resolve them faster than slower. Because you hit it on the head. If we have a catastrophic loss with the FAIR Plan, I don't know what we do to try to resolve that. It's just going to create more chaos.
It's going to be terrible.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rex. I appreciate your time and your presentation from the Personal Insurance Federation of California. And we will now move forward to our next speaker. Thank you. We'd like to now move on to our next speaker, and that is Tina Keel with the effect of rising insurance rates with regards to homeowner associations. And she is with the CLAC. Hi, Tina. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for being
patient.
Thank you
to the Board of Equalization. Oh, my pleasure. That it was some really robust and powerful information today, and I was happy to learn through it and listen to it, and just happy to be here and share information with you folks on kind of what we're going through in the industry. So it's been great to be on for that. So and thank you for having me. So I'm with CAI, that's the Community Association Institute, and our California Legislative Action Committee as a volunteer.
Thank you.
And that group is, made up of many different business professionals, and I happen to be an insurance agent, broker agent for the property and casualty side, the retail side. And so they had me on today simply because I'm working with a lot of customers that are out there searching for insurance, specifically homeowners associations, so that commercial side of things. So it's been a really interesting process, you know, watching the personal lines, single homes go through rate increases, you know, 2017, 2018, seeing 150% rate increases and just kind of some movement over to California Fair Plan. And on the commercial side, we were kind of waiting. It's kind of like turning an oil tanker in the ocean. Commercial insurance takes a little bit longer to see some movement, but about 2020, 2021, we started seeing some pretty significant movement, rate increases and non-renewals, specifically in the high fire areas. Obviously, you know, over the last decade and sustaining some of those larger losses, and had customers in the Paradise area, so saw them sustain those losses, and then seeing kind of the response from our insurance companies from there, trying to hold on where we could for our customers and find the best rate possible and work with them on those non-renewals. And, you know, fast forward to now, we're really seeing a shift out of those high fire hazard areas over into the urban suburban areas as well. And so, you know, it's kind of moved or shifted, and really that's as a result of capacity. We have insurance companies that are really tightening their reins. They can't take on as much risk, so they are minimizing their underwriting guidelines to very specific, you know, key factors or risk they're willing to accept. And in those suburban urban areas, you know, they're getting really stringent on what they're looking at. So we kind of shifted our focus from, you know, responding to those non-renewals in the high fire hazard zones or those brush areas, and we're really looking at pretty much most homeowners associations that are renewing are going through a process where they're shopping their insurance, either because they've been non-renewed or their rates have gone up to a significant degree, and they're unable to pay those premiums. So I thought it would be helpful to share with you some of the things that we're seeing in those non-fire areas that are affecting communities as well, and then some responses to that. So, you know, I'll put it out there. I was born in the 80s, and according to insurance companies, communities that were built in the 70s and 80s are old and aging, and they're looking for updates for those buildings. So, you know, that time frame, that 70s and 80s, wasn't really a concern in the past. You know, we were really looking at communities that were built in the early 1900s as really difficult to place. And then, you know, as we get into the 50s and 40s, we're starting to get into some rough territory. But now we're looking at communities that were built in the 80s as hard to place. One of the issues with community associations is that, and we're talking really condominium associations or attached dwelling buildings, is that the homeowners association is really only responsible to maintain the common area components. So think of the exterior of the building and the roofing, for the most part, and any common area facilities in the exterior. But these carriers are really concerned with the innards of the structure. So the plumbing, the heating, the cooling system, and the electrical. And many communities cannot prove that there have been updates to those components because it's been left up to the unit owner to, you know, do those updates. And many of those units have sold multiple times since the 70s, 80s, or older, and it's really hard to prove updates. So we've been able to get around with some carriers that, you know, it's a unit owner responsibility for those components. But we're really seeing carriers push back and say it's still a major concern. It's a safety concern, and it's a structure concern to know if electrical or plumbing has been updated. And so associations are running into this issue pretty significantly. Carriers are looking at the types of components that are present in the common area facilities like Federal, Pacific, Sylvania, or Zinsco electrical panels. Those were some recalled panels and rebranded panels from a previous recall. So if a community has the presence of those electrical panels, they're either extremely hard to place or uninsurable to a level. And then with plumbing, we get into, polybutylene piping, galvanized piping, which a lot of communities don't even know what product plumbing that they have. And so we're going through and asking a lot of these questions that communities have never had to consider before. And we're, as risk managers, asking them to think forward and consider replacing a lot of these components that, one, are really hard to place, or two, very expensive to place when they're already looking at very expensive insurance premiums. So those are some big ticket items. I mean, this is in addition to our normal issues where a community has a lot of amenities. Maybe they have riding trails or pools or clubhouses, or perhaps they even have a heavy loss history with some frequency or severity to it. Those were already known concerns when applying to an insurance company for coverage. But now we have these additional factors, which with these communities that we otherwise wouldn't consider old are now, aged communities. And the Surfside condominium collapse in 2001 really had an impact on looking at those maintenance schedules and how insurance companies look at the financials of a community to make sure that they have the money to do updates that are necessary so that buildings can remain inhabitable and that there's not a major catastrophe like what we saw there in Florida. So there's a lot of different factors that are coming to play with that. And, so we're adding these all to our list as we're trying to help these communities. So we're helping them figure out what's their risk and mitigate that risk, but also try to find carriers. A big factor is total insurable values. A couple folks touched on that earlier, where you might have a community that has 50 million in values or 100 million in values or more, and that limits their ability to find a carrier that's willing to insure with a lot of value in one place, essentially. High rental factor is a problem. You get over 50% rental factor in a condominium association, and you cut half of your available carriers out, and you add in the age and updates and all of that. So we're really, we have a lot of carriers, and then we move down to maybe one or two. And in those unfortunate circumstances, we'll have an insured that doesn't fit in an admitted, primary market carrier like the well-known names that we're all familiar with. And we have to go to the excess and surplus lines market, which just increases their premium substantially. So I have some real life examples that I've worked with in the past couple of months. And in 2021, 22, when this issue was really starting to become difficult, I had customers in the Tahoe Truckee area. I think Bill Evans touched on one of the owners that was actually an evacuation point. I had these customers that they were going to be the fire evacuation point, but they still could not find insurance coverage. They did get offered. They were in the 30 million value in their communities, and they were offered only a $2.5 million coverage limit for $200,000 in premium. So it's just a fraction of what their insurance coverage should be, for exponentially higher than what they were used to paying. And we really got every piece of information together that we could to prove that this community was hardened and they're an evacuation point if there were an area-wide fire, and really couldn't get any movement. So those folks at that time decided to opt for the California FAIR plan. At that time, the coverage was limited at 5 million per location, and they wanted to just stay there to wait out the soft market whenever that may be. And so I believe they're still, in that position as well. Keep in mind that when folks opt for the California Fair Plan, they're really just getting coverage for fire insurance. There's 15 other perils that are typical on a property insurance policy that is missing, and one of those main perils is water damage, which is most of the time the claims that we see come through on a building or structure is a broken pipe, toilet overflow, any number of different types of water damage claims. So they're essentially self-insuring for all of those other perils. And they have that fire coverage and there. So some other examples, we have a $77 million community that we just worked on, was built in the mid-70s, 316 units within that community, so 316 owners. And they unfortunately couldn't prove that there were updates within the community from each of those unit owners, but they didn't have galvanized or polybutylene piping. They didn't have any of the electrical panels that were on the red list. And so they were able to get coverage, thankfully, at the $77 million value. So their coverage wasn't limited, although they were required a $50,000 per unit deductible. And their premium went from last year $100,000 to now $500,000. And their next option available was going to be $1 million with limited coverage and much higher deductibles. And in that scenario, in this market, believe it or not, that's kind of a success story to be able to find them coverage within that middle market for us, not going to excess and surplus, but the premium cost. And it's really important to look at that that's not just this year, it's going to be next year and the year after. So a lot of these communities are having to go through emergency assessments just to cover that unexpected cost of insurance coverage. But next year it's not necessarily going to be an emergency because they're already aware of the situation and they're not sure how they're going to get that within their budget and from their owners within the community. And really financially is a difficulty for a lot of communities, many communities. So my other example is I have a community that's a $95 million total insurable value. So all of their structures within the community is $95 million. They're in the Santa Rosa area, which we all know was hit with the Tubbs fire in 2017. There are about 122 units within the community. And they had ended up in the excess and surplus lines market with only $10 million in coverage. And their premium was $800,000. This was substantially higher. They were, not anywhere close to paying this type of premium previously. And in an effort to help their community financially, they ended up calling on some help with the political organization, and actually was connected with the California Fair Plan. And so they were able to get a California Fair Plan policy for $20 million. They were only paying $66,000 for this policy. But the main issue is that they don't have any of those other covered perils. So whomever they were working with did suggest that a wrap policy for all the other perils other than fire was easily obtainable and not expensive. But unfortunately, on the commercial side of things, that is not a program that is available. We do see some wildfire exclusion programs, but a wrap policy that's typical of the personal line side, where you have an individual home and you go to California Fair Plan and then you get a companion policy from an insurance company. That's not yet a widely available thing on the commercial side. So that community, in an effort to save themselves premium and really stay financially solvent, went to Fair Plan, and they're kind of in this limbo pattern. So the idea is, as many of the folks said today, the idea is to get as soon as possible these folks out of Fair Plan and back into a standard market when it's available. We just don't really know when that is. And so to kind of wrap this all up, these are some of the tough stories that we're hearing, and this is a daily occurrence. My territory is in the greater Sacramento area, North Bay, all the way up to Truckee and the Reno area. So I have a pretty big territory. So I see a lot of different landscape, urban, suburban, and those rural areas and the troubles that they're having. And what we're really recommending communities do is speak with agents that specialize in community association insurance to help them walk through amending their governing documents and working through those special assessments with their general counsel, folks that really know how HOAs work. And, it's a learning process right now for a lot of communities and for us to how we work through this issue together. And so that's a little bit of what we're seeing. Hopefully that wasn't too much information all at once for you folks, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
No, thank you so much, Tina. Appreciate that. And you shed a lot of light on what's happening on the commercial side. And that's something we didn't really talk about in terms on the personal line side, the wraparound policy that you really need for all those additional coverages when you go through the FAIR plan. And you don't have that luxury on your side. But we do have questions. I've got Deputy Controller Emran would like to ask a couple. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you, Ms. Kill. We love all the information. It's all going on the record, and we're going to formulate a great plan moving forward here, working with the governor's office and the legislator, of course, as well. So when you talk about multifamily, you talk about apartments, and you talk about those tough stories, I think about our low-income seniors, our low-income families that are working hard, the working class people, every single day are getting up to go to work, and they can't afford to be hit with a huge bill, or they can't afford not to be covered by insurance. I just had one question here. In regards to HOA insurance, does it cover all the members' needs, or do they have to obtain separate insurance as well?
That's a great question. It really depends. It's a case-by-case basis. So we see in these condo or attached dwelling communities, it can be anywhere from a complete interior coverage, including upgrades and additions since the community was built, or it could be a bare walls policy. So most of the time, if you are an owner of a condominium association, you want to have your own interior HO6 policy. And you will, if the community is a bare walls, you will need to add some dwelling coverage to the interior. At the very least, you want coverage for your personal effects, your, couch, furniture, all of your contents, and loss of use if the home became uninhabitable due to a loss. So I know that a lot in the past, a lot of master policies were very inclusive, and many people would not purchase HO6, but we always recommend owners obtain that additional policy for their own protection.
Great. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Mr. Schaefer?
Thank you. I think I may be the expert in California on the issue of arrogance on the part of homeowner board and homeowner management. I've owned condos in Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, San Diego, and I've also been a tenant many times in condos. I was a caretaker for Dion Rich, who was the world's greatest gatecrasher, and he had 3 months of his condo being flooded because they're inadequate roofing, and they would not settle with him on the cost. This 90-year-old man had to go to court. I filed the small claims action for him and let him prosecute it himself with his full-time caregiver. He won $8,500. They wouldn't pay it. He's 92 years old. They filed a trial de novo to force him to go to again. And they ended up settling it on a non-cash basis where they give him 3 or 6 months credit on homeowner dues and stuff like that. But if there was not that arrogance, they could have just had a little meeting and said, we'll give you 6 months homeowner dues or something. I see such arrogance in the part of management of condo associations. When I was living there, I noticed some of the numbers were missing from mailboxes. And so I called up the outside management company to ask them about it. And I was told, don't call us, you're just a renter. I was renting from some out-of-state owner. It was right by the beach in Ocean Beach. And she said, you're harassing me when you call me on the phone. I was becoming, because they think renters in condo associations do nothing but dirt. So I showed up at the homeowner meeting just to see if they were going to talk about the missing mailbox numbers that I'd offered to replace. They cost $2 a piece or something. And they wouldn't start the meeting till I left. And I wouldn't leave. And they called the police and had me escorted out of the meeting. Such arrogance on the part of management, and it's that kind of attitude that's forcing insurance companies to have to raise their rates. I could go on and on. I used to publish a newspaper at a condo in Las Vegas that had 114 residents, and I put out a little weekly newsletter about all the exciting things going on, and I was critical, surprise, surprise, of management. And management had a thug in the building that was a felon, and they told him, we need your help to get Mr. Schaefer to move. He actually assaulted me twice. And then they got an injunction against me distributing my little homeowner newsletter that I put out every week. There were 10 of the buddies of the board, or the board themselves, would not want that under their door. So they didn't get it. Only the rest of the people did. But I did put a bunch down by the mailbox in case somebody wanted it. And at one point, the cops were called on the theory that I had distributed to somebody I wasn't supposed to. They must have gotten a copy at the mailbox and said, Schaefer put this under my door. So here I'm hauled into court for contempt of court. I have never seen such arrogance on the part of homeowner dues. I had half a dozen homeowner disputes with them that they wouldn't even talk to me about, and I filed small claims actions. The amount of dispute was never more than about $2,000 or $3,000. If they communicated with me and said, well, can we settle this? I'll say, yeah, well, it's $500 or $1,000, that would be fine. They spent in excess of $100,000 on attorney fees from a very expensive firm in Reno who had an office in Las Vegas to file motions and make a big federal case out of little small claims cases.
Member Schaefer, can we stay focused on the insurance issue, please?
Well, it's an insurance issue because I can see that throughout California, the rising cost of insurance companies is because their client, who I guess is homeowner management, is arrogant. And if there's some way that we could get some lack of arrogance, maybe we could get some sweet pills and force them to eat them, I would think the insurance rates would go down. I know you can't do that. I know I can't do that. I think that maybe what we need to do is have the legislature, consider this as part of the overall plan. But I want you to know that one reason we have rising insurance rates is because the homeowner association management doesn't want to talk to the owners who are critical of them, and owners are always critical of management. And they certainly don't want to talk to tenants, and there are an awful lot of tenants of homeowner association. And also, I think it's wrong that we require the tenants to buy insurance. I look on the phone, insurance is like $1 a day, like $360 for the homeowners are forced to buy. I don't think it's mandatory in other states. It's mandatory in California. I do think we need to get rid of the mandatory requirement that tenants buy homeowner insurance. I am forced as a tenant to buy homeowner insurance for $10,000 or $20,000 worth of valuables. And actually, everything I own is worth maybe less than $1,000 in the condo. So that just shows that there are things that are related to the rising cost of homeowner insurance, and I want you to know I'm an expert on all these problems. If you have a committee hearing, I'll be there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mr. Schaefer. Are there any questions, other questions that you may have? Oh, okay, Chair Lieber.
I'll just
Thank you.
very briefly say that I wanted to thank Ms. Keel for coming here today. You've presented a really unique perspective, and a scenario that I've seen play out with some of my constituents is where there's inclusionary zoning, and someone who is really of modest means is able to purchase a unit, but then something happens and they're kind of stuck in that scenario. So I appreciate your volunteer efforts in this regard very much. And as Mr. Emron said, we're going to take all the information that we've gathered today and really parse it through and be able to come up with some strategies out of it. So thank you so much.
Pleasure, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Is it Keel?
You are,
Okay,
yes.
wonderful, great. Yeah, thanks again. We really appreciate your perspective, from the Community Association Institute, and in particular on this insurance crisis. And it's really interesting that, a lot of these associations are maybe insured 10 or 20% to value, given that the market is so constrained and it's so expensive. Is there, just as a wrap up, is there any effort, because you said that some of these HOAs are using emergency authority to assess, but you had indicated that that was only good for 1 year and thereafter the authority was lost. Is there any remedy to that? Do you change the CC&Rs for the HOA, or how does that work?
There's statutes in place to protect communities from boards being able to assess, and those governing documents are part of that protection as well. It's not necessarily that a community can't do an emergency assessment for more than 1 year, but they have to give substantial reasoning behind why they consider it an emergency. Knowing that they already had this insurance issue the previous year makes it a little bit more difficult. And so we urge our boards to contact their general counsel to go through the process to make sure they're following the correct route in either being able to emergency assess or not on that second or third year. In some cases, the board doesn't have any other choice. They need those funds to pay for the insurance policy. And so this is kind of new territory that we're in. And so if they can change their governing documents to purchase less than full replacement cost, that is very helpful. Because if they have a policy where they're offered a 10 million sublimit and their values are 95 million, they're already out of compliance with their governing documents. And in some cases, governing documents allow in certain circumstances to purchase less if unavailable, but many governing documents don't.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the process that we're going through with communities.
Great. Thank you, Tina Keel, Community Associations Institute, California Legislative Action Committee. Thanks so much. Appreciate your input.
My pleasure.
All right, take
Hope
care.
you folks have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, at this point, we're going to go ahead and open this up for public comment. Do we have any callers?
Let's see. We have no one in the audience who wanted to make a public comment, and we have no written comments that we've received. So let's go to the AT&T moderator. AT&T moderator, is there anyone on the line who'd like to make a public comment regarding our informational hearing?
Ladies and gentlemen on the phones, if you'd like to make a comment, please press 1 then 0 on your phone's keypad at this time. That's 1 0 to queue up for comment. Madam Chair, we have no phone respondents queuing up at this time.
Okay,
We have no one. Thank you.
wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank the board and Chair Lieber for letting me put this on the agenda for discussion. I think it was very helpful and provides some clarity in terms of what the challenges are, and we need to stay engaged with our legislature. And it was wonderful having Senator Ben Allen here, because I think that's just important to have that communication back and forth. And you talked about the value of the BoE and having opportunity to take a look at areas in a more in-depth way, which we've been doing for a couple of years now. And I think this is another example of that, so thank you.
Well, I'll just add, Mr. Gaines, thank you so much for putting this together. It was very inclusive and has given us so much to think about and work on. We heard from some old familiar voices and some new voices in this process. And thank you to all the members for engaging in a very serious way on this topic that is so vital to our constituents. And I want to thank staff for hanging in there with us over this 2-day meeting. Thank you to Ms. Stowers for the snacks that she provides at each of our meetings here to keep us out of that growly range that we can get in at times. And I think that this has been a very special and productive 2 days. And last closing comments, Mr. Schaefer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was very impressed with the program today, and thank Member Gaines, Vice Chair Gaines, for putting it together. I would like to invite our Executive Director to update the agenda as best we can. We had today a marvelous presentation from Michael Martinez, but he was nowhere on the agenda. Mr. Burke gave us quite a presentation, but he was nowhere on the agenda. He was a substitute. Bill Evans was nowhere on the agenda. I understand some of these changes were known within 5 days before the meeting. I would like to recommend that any changes we know about within 24 hours of the meeting, that at least our copies be updated with a little comment as to a change, so that when we're sitting here, we can address people by name and know who they are. And I would hope that you'd request that. I'm sort of very involved in the insurance world, involuntarily, I guess. My father spent his whole life with California Western States Life Insurance here in Sacramento as an agent in San Diego area. When I went to law school at Georgetown, my mentor, when I talked about it, was Tom Levy, who founded Farmers Insurance, which writes in every field. And he was class of 23, and I was class of 63 at Georgetown. And I used to see him every year at the bar convention. He wasn't practicing law, he was owning farmers, but he did go to the state bar every year and have lunch with the Georgetown people. And when he died, he left tens of millions, I'm sure, to the campus, because they built a lot of student housing in his name. And the final comment, which I probably should not tell you about, that I owned an insurance company myself after I got out of law school. I was fascinated by the bond that you can have instead of an insurance. A bond, as you know, is not insurance. It requires the person, if you have an accident, I pay for it, but you have to reimburse me. And I started the California Financial Responsibility Company. I got some little cards printed up that you could carry in your wallet. I dreamed up the rate just out of whimsy at about $1 a day. It was $350 a year if you wanted a premium for a bond. And I would explain to you, it's not insurance. If you have a little fender bender or whatever, I'll pay for it, but you've got to pay me back. And I saw in the statute you had to have a license. It wasn't very particular. It didn't say it had to come from the Department of Insurance, which really is a fact. So I went to San Diego City Hall and for $25 bought a business license for the California Financial Responsibility Company. And I ran little ads in a weekly newspaper. And I had 15 customers, 3 of which were me and my 2 kids, but we had a dozen members of the public buying the insurance. And I issued a dozen policies before the Department of Insurance sent a couple of gentlemen around to see me to explain that I might be committed a felony and I should close up the business, which I did. But that was my moment as an insurance mogul. Thank you.
Well, you are nothing if not creative, Mr. Schaefer. We have got to give that up completely to you. Mr. Emron, closing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also want to thank Mr. Vice Chair Gaines for this incredibly informative hearing today in the last 2 days as well, thanking the staff as well. I think there's no other way to put it, but this is a California insurance crisis. We're seeing devastation, especially this winter, all around the state, and I think this Board of Equalization is in a prime position to respond, to mobilize, to help our taxpayers in this crisis. And that's what elected representation is, so important. And I'm hoping that we're going to take all this information that we gathered here today, mobilize and all hands-on-deck approach across the entire state of California, the California state government, and also working with our local government and federal government and making sure that we have an appropriate response. And as you can see from the hearings today, there's quite a bit of moving parts here in 2024, so we're going to make sure we stay on top of this and can't wait for what's to come. Thank you so much to you all, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Vasquez.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo all the compliments and thank once again Vice Chair for following up on this. And it sounds like, I know at one point Member Schaefer was kind of anti-workshops, but it looks like he might have changed his opinion here now that he sees the value of these. But at the end of the day, I think we got a good little, at least an outline of what we need to do, and looking forward to moving forward on hopefully some recommendations. And it sounds like we're going to have some good interest from not only our legislative body, but possibly the federal government as well on this.
Yeah, good.
And Mr. Gaines will give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I focused the thank yous. I want to thank the entire team in terms of this taking time for nearly a full day hearing here. So each of you, thank you for coordinating all this, but in particular, Kathy Young, just want to thank you for all of your effort and being the tip of the spear with the BoE. And then I also want to thank both Matt Cox and Betsy Hodges in my office, because they put in a lot of effort to have this run smoothly. Appreciate the comments coming from Member Schaefer in terms of the agenda. What happens is it goes to print in advance, and we're not hearing back from folks in the right timing, and that's what happened here. But your suggestion to get a full agenda, everybody, is well taken, and because I had the names of everybody, and we could have gotten copies of that and gotten it out to all of you. I was not aware of the fact you didn't have that. So, but yeah, just an overall great opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines, and thank you to your entire team and our wonderful BoE team who are just amazing. So our last item for the day is adjournment. We will adjourn the board at 2:22 p.m. And our next regular meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, and Wednesday, March 20th, 2024. Thank you, members.